Good afternoon. My name is Reverend Brianna Ilene, and I am the Director of Ecumenical Innovation and Justice Initiatives at the Wisconsin Council of Churches, and I am delighted to have you all join us today. I feel like this webinar is something that we need right now. I actually wrote an article that went out in our e-news this morning talking about how we're doing so much. There's a lot of folks who are doing a lot of defensive work, but how do we also kind of move into the space of what are we for? What are we building? And so I am super excited that I feel like this is one of those spaces where we can begin to imagine and talk about that a little bit. This webinar is part of the Council's Repenting of Christian Nationalism sermon series and a resource that is coming out of that. And again, it's that we repent from Christian nationalism, but then what are we also building? How do we move forward? And I will drop, after I'm done talking, I'll drop the link in the chat if you have not downloaded those resources. And if you're not doing it, that's fine. You are also welcome here because this is a resource that I think is multifaceted and we can all use. So as we move in, I'd like to introduce my friend Sophia. Um, Sophia is a 1.5 generation Filipino American who resides on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people. She works alongside communities in the areas of justice, anti-racism, and climate solutions as they do the necessary work of imagining the world they want to build and animating others to join them in creating a more just society where all may thrive. Sophia is no stranger to public service, as much of her life work has involved communication, advocacy, and engagement in the areas of educational access, immigration, economic justice, healthcare, anti-poverty, and homelessness. Sophia works as the Race and Social Justice Lead Advisor in the city of Seattle. Prior to this, she led the equity efforts in K-12 sector, sound transit, and with the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges, a federated system of 34 community and technical colleges in Washington. And I actually know Sophia through United Methodist communication or United Methodist connections. We served on a board together a few years ago, and so she is a are commissioned deacon. What's the correct term? She is a deaconess. I forget the terminology. I'm a bad United Methodist, but she is a deaconess in the United Methodist Church, and so also a great faith leader that I know I often look um, to lead, or not to lead, but to just find inspiration and support. And so I am so appreciative of you joining us today. And so I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, friend. It's such a joy to be with you all today. And I realize in my getting ready for the slides, I probably took up the whole screen rather than leaving the slides off for you to be able to see our faces. So I apologize for that. Glad to be sharing space with you all virtually. I'm joining you from DC. Actually, we were just wrapping up a sustainability conference that I presented at on communication. So I'm glad to transition out of that into this time with you all. So I know we have an hour together, so I'm going to just start sharing my screen. Are there any logistical things that we should be aware of before we start? The chat is open, so if folks want to participate in that way, you can use the little chat button on there and just make sure that when you chat, you're certainly welcome to just chat the two of us if you have something you need to say, but you're also welcome to, I believe, send a chat to everyone. So if you just use the little drop down on that chat window, then you can send the message to everyone if it's a thought or a musing or wondering that you want to share for everyone. That can be another way for us to engage. And I'm not distracted by those things at all. So if that's a way for folks to participate, you're most welcome to do that. So I will share my screen and we will get started. And this is being recorded, so we just want to also remind folks of that. I know you might have heard that as you were coming in. Okay, let's get started. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay, beautiful. All right. So, who will we be together? I think this is a question we are all invited to answer, not just in this particular moment, but always, right? Who will we be together? How will we show up together? How will we collaborate, co-create in this work of justice, bringing about, practicing shalom, all of those pieces. And so, in this particular moment in our nations present? I think it's a question that is that we are invited to continue asking of ourselves and of one another. So our time together today is really spent around this idea of storytelling for change and imagining a more just future. And we'll begin to weave what that could look, sound, and feel like together. So, what I hope we will cover, and when we were designing what this hour could look like, there was a lot of, is it going to be like super tactical? Like here are some lesson plans that you could do. But I think where we landed was this is a moment for us to pause and to breathe and to also do some dreaming and imagining together. So there are pieces here that I'm going to kind of weave throughout. And if folks want my contact info after this, like you're welcome to share it if people want to be in more conversation. So please know that if you're one of those folks who continues to kind of mull over things afterwards and then you have questions and wonderings, then I'm happy to connect after this. So what I hope we'll cover is for us to ground one another in the stories that have shaped us. And because this is a webinar format, it might be that grounding is a more internal process, and then it happens either as a group later as you are perhaps offering or participating in some Lenten studies or small groups or circles together. That might be a practice that you do either on your own in self-reflection or with other people. We're invited to name those things that must be reimagined. We know that the world that exists and as it exists today is not the world that can be. And so I think a part of our work as people of faith and people who care about one another is that we're constantly imagining and reimagining what could be. And I think that we have seen glimpses of what the world could be when we practice mutual aid, when we practice creating things together, when we practice growing things, right? And I think that to be able to find solutions to things and to begin to work together on what those things could be. So we also have to name what those are, right? What name, and you mentioned this earlier, name what perhaps we don't want, but also name the thing that we are moving toward. The other piece that I hope we will spend some time doing is to learn about this story-based strategy framework from folks that link movement building and analysis of narrative power so that we can examine perhaps the narratives and the stories that have formed us, but maybe don't need to exist anymore or that need to be reimagined. And I think, this particular series that you all are engaging through this Lenten season is an example of that, right? And I think we have seen many examples of the ways that our faith, people of faith, and people who are part of interfaith communities, multi-faith communities, know that what we have often seen to be co-opted by folks who have a particular understanding and practice of Christianity, for example, is maybe not how we interpret and apply sort of that invitation to be followers of a very loving and just God. So you'll learn about a few frameworks and practices, and then maybe we can even, as you learn about some of these practices and we engage in this hour together, that you can think about what the contours of a community of practice could look like. So say you hear or see something here and you're like, I would love for us to continue exploring that through the weeks of Lent. And that could be something that maybe begin to plant the seeds in your own mind and with others in your community. Community agreements, typically I'll invite folks to basically think about how we want to share space together. And this is really important, I find, when people are talking and sharing their opinions and ideas and their truths, that sometimes they bump up against one another and they don't always land in the ways that we intend. And so this is an invitation and my not promise, but my sort of commitment to you in this time that I will be curious, that I will be conscious of the ways that my intent might not match the impact of my words or actions, and that we're all invited to take care of ourselves. So if you need to step away, if something else is calling your attention, that you take care of what you need to take care of. And if you are, going to host circles or small groups that talk about these topics that are very can be contentious, full of a lot of feelings, that you consider how you might want to develop some community agreements and invite people to share space together. So this is an example of what some of those could look like. Okay, so throughout this, it's going to be both like presentation, but also dialogue, even though it doesn't feel like a dialogue because I'm the only one talking. But please do engage in chat if you feel called to do that. But I also wanted to be able to teach some practices and activities that you might be able to take in other spaces that you were a part of. So when there are difficult conversations that happen, sometimes emotions are heightened, rightfully so, that these are practices that can help us pause and reflect a little bit, right? So one of the practices could be this idea of a pie. I love a good pie. And it actually stands for something. So sometimes these are good to sort of like pause in between conversations or as you transition to different parts of an activity or a time that you're gathering together. In addition to taking some good deep breaths and regrounding yourselves and feeling, the chair that you're sitting in and your feet on the ground, that we're invited to think about pies. So physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And this is not my acronym, but it was developed by other folks. This particular one I found on the organization politicalhealers.org/pies, and you can go to that and learn more about sort of each of those pieces, but I'll go into it in just a moment. So think pies. So P is for physical, and it's really kind of doing a scan, right? When you're getting really activated by something, something you heard or something someone said, as you take a breath, also sort of do a scan. How is my body? Where do I feel tension? Is it in my shoulders? Am I wearing them up like this? Are my fists kind of clenching? How is my physical body reacting to what I heard, what I just heard or saw or saw? The I is for intellectual, and I had to say this out loud because there was one presentation and I flipped the I and the E, and so it didn't spell pies. It didn't make sense. But the I is for intellectual. What has been on my mind, like how, when we come to these spaces, sometimes we're bringing like 10 other things with us, right? And so, what is on my mind? Do I feel challenged or stimulated intellectually? The E is for emotional. What feelings can I identify in myself right now? What do I need to process this feeling? And then spiritual or social can be, do I feel at peace? How do I feel connected to myself and to my surroundings? And do a gut check. How does my gut feel? So this is an invitation and practice if you'd like to do it yourself or teach it to others that pies can be a way that we um, recenter ourselves. Okay, yes, it's always good to gather around food too. Okay, so a little bit about me. Uh, I'm a deaconess, and deaconesses and home missioners within the United Methodist Church are a recognized lay order of people called to be in this lifetime relationship in the United Methodist Church, explicitly around vocations of ministries of love, justice, and service. And so we have folks in our order that are AMTs, that are teachers, that are working in city government and in educational institutions, and it kind of spans the gamut. So that's just a little bit about the lay order that I'm a part of. Okay, so if you're able or interested, if you want to share your name, you can, maybe where you're joining from, anything, any sort of brief thing that you want to share about yourself, you are welcome to, since we don't have the use of audio. I, find it helpful to be another way to connect with people, even if I get to recognize where in the state they're from or maybe a congregation that I, used to be affiliated with. You are welcome to do that in the chat. Okay, thank you for those that have started to do that. Thank you. So, okay, so story. I would propose that change, and we can think about all sorts of change, right? Change starts with our story. And I say this because we are seeing, and I don't want to focus so much on our particular federal leadership here in the United States, but I think it feels the most sort of like um, an obvious place to start. And we don't have to just stay there, but certainly it's been something that's been on our minds as we scroll on social media. We are seeing that there are a lot of stories being told, right? And I think that if we are able to think about how change might transpire, it's really important to know our own story. And by our, I could mean sort of my story individually. I could mean the story of my family. I could mean the story of my congregation, my faith tradition, my community. And so I want us to think about this idea that change starts with our story. There is an organizer no longer with us by the name of Grace Lee Boggs out of Detroit, who would often say and ask folks like how they were transforming themselves, because if we transform ourselves, then we can transform the world. So it's this invitation to the attention to our own sort of inner working and transformation and that external to us. Okay, so a few quotes here that I think can help us kind of frame our conversation, and this is by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she has a TED Talk, author, scholar, but wrote, "I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this, that it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult, and it emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar." And I think we're in a moment now where things are very polarizing, right? Where you go to church, what restaurant or fast food place you eat at or don't eat at, where you get your coffee, right? These are all things that sort of make up the story of who we are, at least to people who might just kind of see us on our surface. And I think we're also invited to a deeper engagement, reflection with one another to remind one another we are not made up of one story, one event, one experience, right? And so I think the invitation for us, even as we muddle through, right, all of this, not just this particular series through Lent, but the next 4 years, the next 10 years, as we are in community with one another, that we pause, that we ask ourselves, is there more to this story about this person, about this event, about this thing that I heard about? Okay, so I'm not a scientist by any means, but I do find it fascinating and really interesting, and I think helpful for us to think that stories are not just things that we tell, right? But stories really form our understanding and view of the world, and stories move us in a way that maybe a news article or a research, journal piece might not be able to move us. Though I also think that data and those types of stories are also really important. But this is um, from a book called Reimagining Change: How to Use Story-Based Strategy to Win Campaigns, Build Movements, and Change the World. Um, and they talk about how humans are hardwired for narrative, and that brain researchers have discovered that hearing a powerful story about an experience will stimulate the same neurological region as having the actual experience, right? And we can all remember sort of whether it's a movie that we're watching or podcast that we're listening to or a book that we're reading, that we're sort of entranced and we're captivated because of the ways that a story is being told. And so, um, I think we're invited as we think about storytelling for change, that stories play a particular role and can be a particular vehicle to help move us to social transformation. Toni Morrison wrote that narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. And so there's this uh, really, I think, beautiful way that we can think that as we are telling stories and creating new narratives, that we're also recreating ourselves in our organizations, right? In the telling and retelling of a particular story that perhaps either needs to be retired or rebuilt or reimagined. So I want to look at a particular story as an example. So when we look at our current world, right, of intersecting social and ecological crises, racial crises, we could see that we are living in an era of outdated stories rooted in violence and exploitation. I don't think that those are just my hot take. I think that we can point to many examples of what that looks like, right? So here's an example. If you follow politics at all, this is Representative Justin Jones. Justin is also United Methodist. And I got to know Justin when I lived in Tennessee and did some organizing alongside. So if you look at the sort of big poster that says Justin Jones, it has the three of his images there. It says at the bottom, "The South will rise anew." And, if you're familiar with US history and the South at all, there was the saying, "The South will rise again," right? And I think that uh, what he did, which I thought was really brilliant, is flip that on its head to say the South will not rise again, the South will rise anew. And so for me, like, this was another really beautiful example of how we are taking an old trope and narrative and reimagining it for something totally different and reusing it for a different purpose. And I think we can maybe, point to many examples of how we have reimagined ourselves, how our communities have reimagined themselves, and how we are um, just moving and showing up in the world differently than we might have because we are called to be something else in this particular time. And so I just want to show this as an example to say that and to invite us to think about like what are the stories that are outdated that need to be put to rest or that need to be reimagined completely. Um, and to be able to do that, I think we have to be able to notice, right, and name the things that we're seeing and experiencing. What are the stories, the tropes, the stereotypes, the narratives that really have formed how we how this world exists, right? Whether it's our church institutions and organizations, whether it is the government, whether it is, think of many of the institutions that we are a part of, that it has often been built on perhaps inaccurate and just plain untrue stories of one another, right? So, and I think oftentimes we might see this more maybe in the church or faith-based organizations and nonprofits, that we have a particular understanding of who needs our help or who needs to be saved or who needs our resources, right? And I think in this particular moment, we are invited to rethink what that is, even if what that is the foundation on which we built many of our programs, many of our, and much of our existence, right? And so I think this is an opportunity to say, if what we are seeing blast across social media and the news and espoused by our neighbors is not who we are, then who are we to be in this moment and how do we communicate that? And how do we interrupt, frankly, some of these harmful narratives that really need to be dismantled and put away? Okay, so one opportunity for us to engage in that reflection is by thinking about windows and mirrors. So windows help us to see what's in front of us, kind of, what's around, because you can peek out there, and maybe even what's ahead just a little bit. It's our context, right? And so right now, it's actually a very warm 50 something degrees outside. But you can gaze out your window at night, in the middle of the day, first thing in the morning, and you're going to see different things. And that's going to give you some context about what's outside. Mirrors, on the other hand, give us a reflection of ourselves, right? So you can take a mirror, you look in the mirror, depending on how closely you want to look, right? If you're looking for something, you can get up pretty close and you're like, I need to tweeze out this eyebrow. I have a hair growing out of my chin. Like I missed this spot when I was putting my foundation on. Like you can get up pretty close and your mirror can help you kind of see things that you wouldn't have seen if you were just kind of sitting back, right? And so I think mirrors can give us a reflection of ourselves, and we can see how closely, we look to see more things if we choose to look that close, right? And so mirrors give an opportunity to sort of critique and address if we choose. We can see ourselves and what's behind us, right? Looking behind us if we choose. And I think mirrors, if we want to, can give, a pretty accurate reflection of what is immediately in front of us. And sometimes even highlight some of those things that we don't understand as we're looking. So, as we're thinking about narratives or as we're thinking about the stories that have formed us or the stories that we need to tell differently, I just want to pause for maybe, 30 seconds or so. What are the windows and the mirrors that we are looking at and through in our own lives, in our own congregations, in our own families even? What are the windows that you're looking out of that can help you to see what's in front of you, what's around you, what is your context? And then what are those things that are helping to reflect who we are as leaders, as members of communities, as congregations? So I'm just going to pause for just a few seconds. And if you want to jot it down, you can. If you want to put it in the chat, you're welcome to. But what are those things? And, you know, um, it can be something like policies, right? The policies are reflecting back to us who we say we are. And if what we read in there is not who we are, then maybe perhaps we should relook at those policies to better reflect, right, who we believe ourselves to be and how to align that with how we talk about ourselves and what we say we believe. And so, spend another just like 10 seconds or so thinking about what are those mirrors and windows that are helping us to understand our context and to see our context, and to reflect back to us who we who we are, because sometimes who we are and who we say we are very different things, right? And I think it's important sometimes for us to be reminded that there could be a gap between how we show up in the world, and how people experience us, our communities, our congregants, our peers. So keep some of those thoughts in mind as we continue. Okay, so again, Um, this could be, I think this could be a conversation that you take back if you do small group studies. It could be a conversation or a question that you take back to church council meetings, right, to your leadership to ask yourselves, what are the mirrors and the windows showing us about our work, both individually, collectively, and what our work looks, sounds, and feels like in various contexts that we find ourselves. Okay, so moving sort of into having a real explicit strategy around story. And there's a book written by Tricia Hersey, who is a theologically trained womanist, who wrote the book Rest is Resistance. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. She dubs herself as the NAP bishop or the NAP minister. Her whole kind of persona is built around this idea of nap ministry, right? Lay down period. You deserve rest. Rest is our birthright. And so it has an accompanying rest deck. So it's a deck of cards and you can pull it out. It's affirmations, it's invitations. And I have found it to be a beautiful practice. Thank you, Pastor Tracy. Yes. So what I've done is like, I bring it when I have meetings, I'll just say, hey, pull a card and let that be kind of your invitation for the day or for the week. So she says this. She says, I can daydream for hours a day and vividly remember this as a daily practice since I was a child. In those daydreaming moments, I was processing my own history and imagining worlds that felt real. I was creating history as I paused and let my mind and body connect. And, I think we have here in the United States often been taught and trained to disconnect body, mind, and spirit. And now, as we are adults experiencing all manner of things, we're trying to put it back together and we don't quite know how, right? And so I think this is an invitation for us to connect all of those pieces that have oftentimes felt separated on purpose when they really shouldn't be. So, when I think about this idea of radical imagination or this invitation to radical imagination, it's really what can we imagine without constraint? And I think, as adults who have worked, in different organizations with the different structures, imagination isn't always something that we're invited to. We're invited to a lot of structure, actually, and a lot of sort of following the rules. And we have kind of put imagination aside to be this thing that children do. And I think this particular moment, when we find ourselves untethered and unmoored, that radical imagination is an invitation for us. And so it's an invitation to daydream, to experience radical rest, because in doing that, we can reconnect with parts of ourselves, parts of one another we perhaps haven't. So in radically imagining or in radical imagination, we are invited to see the world not as it is now, right? But as it could be. And so that could be a healthy planet that is just and equitable. It could be that all would have access to clean water and clean soil and clean air. It could be that we would all be housed and sheltered, right? Radical imagination doesn't just accept things for what is or how things have been, but recognizes that the world can and should change, right? And that the world that we imagine will not just be better, but completely different, radically different than the world we are experiencing now. And so it's this invitation for us to, muster up the courage to envision a future that is completely unlike the world that we are living in today. And again, I think we have experienced contours of what that could be. But what could it look like without restraint to name exactly what that world could look like, right? That it's boundless, it's limitless, that it doesn't react to or get discouraged by the current realities. And I think oftentimes when we are invited to imagine the practicality of everything starts to come in. It's like, oh, but we don't have the money for that, or we don't have the staffing for that, or that seems not feasible because how would you house everyone, right? And this, radical imagining is inviting us to put the naysaying aside, to put the practicality aside, to say without constraint, what could this look like? Who could we be? What could our communities be like? So that collectively we can actually try to do the thing that we believe can happen. And I think that's part of it is like, do we believe this can happen? And I think oftentimes we say that it could happen or we want that to happen, but in reality, we end up stopping ourselves for lots of different reasons. And so what is the world that we are imagining? What are the communities that we are radically imagining without restraint? Because we believe that it's possible to achieve together. And it might not be in our lifetime, but we believe that it can happen. And I think that's part of it is that a lot of this work that we're naming might not be work that we see in our lifetime. And we have to be okay with that, but we're going to do what we can as long as we're here in these roles to lend to that effort, and to continue paving that way for others that come alongside, when they do. And I think it's really important to be explicit. And this could be an actual activity that you do with by yourself or with a small group or with a congregation or leadership team to say, like, what is the future that we imagine is possible? And I think if we can be explicit and name what that is, then we have something on the horizon that we're working to. And I think sometimes we find ourselves kind of stuck or just kind of floating around because we can't be explicit and name the thing. And if we can't name something, then it's really hard for us to chart a path to get there. And so the invitation here then is to radically imagine, like, what is the world, the congregation, the community that you know to be possible, so that if you can name the contours, then possibly you can chart a path to get to that place. So a part of radical imagination is that the future is us and we are the future, right? So we collectively, whether we say here in the United States or around the world, are experiencing some kind of collective stirring. And we see this oftentimes when, movements pop up, and we can name so many that have started and perhaps stopped, some that are still ongoing. And these movements and the stirring kind of comes up because we know that that there is more than this, right? That abundance, that health, that justice, that love, belonging, all of these things are things that we can grow together by our own hands. And I think we're realizing that more and more, that, like, we cannot look to many of our institutions, government included, to be the ones that supply the things that we know we could create together. And so what are those things that we can create together, that we can grow together by the work of our own hands? Radical imagination is an antidote. And so as we are looking for joy and finding connection, we are really making our own rules, right? So who told us that we couldn't just go to our neighbor and just bring them some food because we made some extra, or we were thinking about them? Who told us that we couldn't just pick up an extra 10 pairs of socks because there was a sale at Target, and right, we want to have something to be able to give if we encounter someone who might need socks because theirs are wet, because their shoes have holes in them? Who told us that we could not, right? Fill in the blank. What are the things, the practices that we have been told that maybe not explicitly that we shouldn't be or couldn't be doing, but really all lend themselves to this practice of the enlivening of this radical imagination, right? And so how do we begin to kind of rewire our brains and ourselves to imagine that the things that we maybe were told, like, you can't do that, or that's strange, right? That we can begin to say, like, no, I want to do this, I need to do this, this is what our communities have asked for. And so how do we rewire ourselves to one another? And I'm reminded every time I take communion, right, that, like, it is a remembering, a recalling, and it is a remembering, a reattaching to one another. And so I think that radical imagination invites us to reattach ourselves to one another, rewire ourselves to one another, so that your thriving is my thriving and vice versa. This idea of radical imagination is rooted in place, right? So we think about, I think oftentimes we think about sort of the big, everyone, everything. We think about what's happening globally. We think about what's happening across the nation. But we sometimes forget to also think about the ways that we are impacted and can impact the goings on in our own neighborhoods, right? And so whether it's the literal ground that is in our front or backyard, right, or just right outside of our doorsteps, whether it's the park that we love to take our kids to, or to take our dog to on a run, whether it's a place that we like to hike to clear our head, how does our relationship with the rest of our natural surroundings, the rest of creation, shape what we imagine is possible as we envision a different and transformed future? So another practice or activity that I want to sort of name and invite folks to is what is the furthest that you can see, right? So we talked about radical imagination. We talked a little bit about, imagining without constraint, about what could be, even though we can catch glimpses of that perhaps. Um, so as you think about the organizations or communities or congregations that you're part of, and you think about the vision for your congregation or your organization, maybe it's in the form of a strategic plan or a vision statement or mission statement. Think about looking as far into the future as you can see, right? Um, and I want you to spend just a few moments kind of thinking about what that is. What's as far as you can see? Is it that, well, we have always been really committed to affordable childcare, so it's really building a childcare center, for example. And that might not happen in the next 5 years, but it can be a plan in the next 10 years. Like, what is the furthest that you can see for your congregation or for your organization? And I want to share this practice because I think it can be really interesting to see kind of what emerges. So if this were an activity that you're going to use perhaps in a group setting, you can change some of this around, but this is just an example. So imagine yourself 10 years from now, you're walking to work, and you see a newspaper. I'm imagining you still have newspapers in some fashion. You pick it, you pick it up, and the headline is celebrating the work of your congregation or your organization. Okay, what is it? What does it say on the front page? What paper is it, right? Maybe the papers that exist now um, no longer exist. And that should say, is it even paper? Because maybe we have all decided that we don't need to waste more paper and that it's in some other form, right? What is the headline? What's the picture? What is the leading article? And so that's an invitation, again, to give folks a way to practice what this imagining could look like. And it could be something that, it could be a conversation that's already started in your congregations, for example. Maybe there's some affordable housing project that you've thought about. Maybe it's taking a piece of land that you own and turning it into a community garden, like whatever that is. It's an invitation to think about how far into the future we can see, in this case, 10 years. What would people be celebrating about what you did? What would the headline be? Um, and just for maybe another 30, 45 seconds, what could that be? Thinking about your own context and your own congregations. If there was something that was being celebrated in the news about something you all did and contributed to, what would that say? And if you have something, you're invited to share that in the chat also. So after you would do this article, or I'm sorry, after you would do this activity, you could invite folks to come back. Maybe if it was a larger group, had them in small groups, and folks kind of talked about what those headlines would be, and then you come back together. And I think what has been always really fun is to see sort of what that shared and collective vision could be. What are the patterns and the longings that have emerged through this headline, right? And I think sometimes it feels risky to be able to say the thing that feels so outlandish and so far out of reach that people don't even want to share. But I think through an exercise like this, it helps people to like imagine without fear or anxiety or maybe like trepidation, because it's just an activity, right? Give people some safer spaces to kind of imagine and dream and put themselves out there in a way that um they wouldn't otherwise, right? And so as people are gathering back together, you can invite people to share sort of what are the patterns that exist. Maybe, you didn't realize that so many folks had interest and passion around like what it could be to support unhoused neighbors. Maybe people, one of the themes that comes out is people are interested in abolishing poverty, right? What would that look like? Maybe people are interested in participating in some kind of guaranteed income. And so I think this could be an activity that helps to frame a few things and give people an opportunity to really practice radical imagination. And in doing that, I think we're also inviting ourselves. Here's the thing, we can read all the things, right? You can watch all the things, we can listen to all the podcasts, we can go to webinars like this, but ultimately we have to practice. And I think this and many other ways are opportunities for us to practice what this is that we say we want to do or be. And it's just like a muscle that you know, work every day. Like if you end up not being able to walk because you had an injury or you got sick, your muscles start to atrophy, right? Or um, you haven't driven for a while, and all of a sudden you get in that car, and that car is a very heavy piece of metal that can cause some damage if you are not, you know, used to and have not been practicing driving. Or, you know, there's a skill that you want to practice, whether it's playing an instrument or cooking, right? That you continue to refine those things. And just like that, like all of these things that we've named, uh, practicing radical imagination, practicing what it looks like to be equitable and just in our practices and our behavior and the words that we say, all these things take practice. And it's helpful to have people to practice that with who can sharpen us, who can guide us, who can tell us like, I don't think that that didn't land with me how you might have thought it to land, right? And so um, all of this for me really is just an invitation for us to continue to go back to that question about who do we want to be together. Okay, I am nearing the end. Yes, this is the end. Okay, so I'll leave you with one more quote from the great Grace Lee Boggs, again out of Detroit, and she names this. She names that people are aware that they cannot continue in the same old way, but are immobilized because they cannot imagine an alternative. We need a vision that recognizes that we are at one of the great turning points in human history where the survival of our planet, the restoration of our humanity, require great sea change in our ecological, economic, political, and spiritual values. And so for me, all of this, not just in this moment, not just in the season of Lent, but our whole lives really, that they might be oriented to um, creating places where people can thrive and feel like they can belong. And there is a tenant, I suppose you could call it, in the work of emergent strategy. So if you haven't read the book by Adrienne Marie Brown called Emergent Strategy, I think it's a helpful work to guide whether you're organizing um, or whether you're leading a congregation, which could be could be one and the same. Um, and one of those tenets says that what we pay attention to grows, and I want us to be thinking about what it is that we want to pay attention to. What is it that we want to grow, um, so that our energy and our efforts, as they're pulled together, are directed in such a way that our energy, our talents, our gifts, our even our wonderings and curiosities are directed in a way that feels like they're towards something that we want to build together. Because we talk a lot about tearing things down, right? Restructuring things, renaming things. And we also want to be about the thing, what is the thing that we're building, and to actually name that. And I'm at time, but there is one thing that I would like to read to you as we close, as I at least close my um, section, and it's from a book called The Four Pivots by someone named Shanjan, right? And in this, he says this, and I think it's our invitation to not just name the things that we want to be against, but also to be about the things that we want to create. So he says this: addressing racism, fighting sexism, and reducing violence are all important, but reductions in these things are not victories in and of themselves, because eliminating things that harm us is not the same as creating things that heal us. Just like the absence of disease doesn't constitute health, nor does the absence of violence constitute peace. Simply ending these problems does little to cultivate the world that we really want. But that is how inequality works, right? It erodes our ability to imagine any other way, and it conditions us to only focus on surface solutions to deep problems. It predefines our dreams and dictates what we can imagine. And that's why so many of us have a hard time describing what freedom feels like, looks like, smells like, and sounds like. We haven't spent much time in that type of question, and sometimes find it difficult to visualize a world that we want to create. And so we spend all of our time resisting white supremacy, fighting racism, confronting patriarchy, deconstructing capitalism, and challenging oppressive systems, and very little time creating belonging, cultivating healing, inventing new systems, and designing our future.
Thank you. I appreciate this so much. Lots to chew on. I was texting some of our staff even during on our channel, like, hey, here's questions for us. We had one question in the chat, and if anyone else has a question, please feel free to either drop it in the Q&A or just in the chat, whatever works best for you. But this was around the idea of imagining. Are we supposed to answer the let's imagine question based on what is realistically possible or based on hopes and dreams?
Yeah, I think this exercise, at least at the beginning, is a sort of hopes and dreams, right? Because I think we can spend a lot of time censoring ourselves, kind of renegotiating what is actually possible or practical given the resources that we have. But I think we're already selling ourselves short, and the exercise is already over if we can't fully, right, without restraint, imagine what is possible. Because even if it's not something that we achieve in our time with the organization, is on our time here on Earth, that it's something that we can say we imagined at one point
Hmm.
and document it somewhere. Because I think that's the other part too of all of this. And I would be remiss as a communications person to not name that, like, uh documented in some way, right? Like even if it's we did an art project or we commissioned this thing or we did a study on, I think all these ways are documenting and stewarding the ways that we have attempted to do the thing. Even if
Hmm.
we don't actually get, accomplish the thing that we said we might have, but these to me are all examples of attempts and attempts and attempts of us practicing and trying to do this very messy work together that we know is possible. And again, like when we see those contours of like, oh, this is what it feels like, this is what it looks like, this is what it sounds like, then we're reminded that like, yes, this is a work worth doing and necessary doing.
So I have a question. When other people don't ask questions, I get to ask my own questions. I feel like we're in a time where there's a lot going on. I know in our organization has been very busy of responding. Oh, we don't want this. We don't want this. We think this is bad. How do we in kind of the how or why do we kind of a both end question, like in this chaos, we're in this chaos mode. How do we create that space to do this imagining? Like what how do we do that? How do we slow down from the chaos to actually do this work? And like, why is it important?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that chaos and confusion and distraction and misdirection are like the name of the game right now, right? And I think we're kind of falling into that. And it's distraction and deflection by way of executive order, at least for the federal government. And so it's important, I'll say it's important to one, take care of yourselves, right? That might mean like turning off the news for a little bit or stop scrolling at two in the morning on your phones, right? Or on your laptops. And at the same time, I think we have to be informed, right? Because I think folks that want to misdirect and distract rely on people um, not actually learning and educating themselves. And so I think that's part of it is like we can't bury our heads in the sand. We do need to stay informed, but also be careful about where you get your news. And maybe you check in with other people to say like, hey, did you read this? Where did you hear that? Right? And we're kind of reflecting, being mirrors and windows to one another. But I think ultimately, as we think about organizations that work in spaces who care for those furthest from justice, and you can name whatever that is, furthest from educational justice, furthest from access, all of those things, then we also have to be grounded in our own stories, right? And so you can ask questions around like, what are our values? You can go back to documents that already exist, like mission, vision, values. You can go back to a strategic plan if you have that. But I would say like, spend some time revisiting who you say you are. And I think if you've gone through those and said, this actually doesn't reflect at all who we are, who we want to be, then maybe that's an opportunity to revisit those and say, how do we more closely align these documents and statements with the practice of how we are showing up in our communities and in the world. And I think we have to sort of also like be really rooted, right? And whether that is um, rooted in, again, back to sort of our values and who we are, but we also are, um, I think, a part of a much more interconnected community than we might be willing to name. If you read this book, Emergent Strategy, like there's a lot of talk about mycelium and fungi and the ways that all of these networks exist that are not apparent to the naked eye. And so, what are the ways that we are building these networks so that we are so strong that we can support one another when someone isn't able to, right? Someone or something or an organization, right? Or our communities collectively. And so how do we build that strong network so that as we're sort of like experiencing whiplash from all the things that are trying to cut us down, deport our communities, cut off aid, like name all the things that we have steeled ourselves, we have created networks that are like chain links that we've just kind of like locked arms together, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. I also think about the emergent strategy concept of small is all or fractals. That's what I find myself in a lot these days of there's all these big things happening. There's executive orders, the federal government, we're responding on the state level. Like my job at the Wisconsin Council of Churches ends up a lot up here. And so
Yeah.
how do I find those small places? Like my family attends a local church. And so what is that church doing? You mentioned mutual aid or little project, well, little little's relative, like
Well, yeah.
there's some building transformation happening. So it's very large project, but like it's really, really local too. And so I think about that, like how do you build what you want to see locally, whether it be in your congregation, whether it be with your neighbors? And you kind of said this earlier too. And so like that feels a lot more accessible to me than when there's all this chaos in these bigger systems. And then how do we grow that network?
Yeah, 100%. And I think we can't, I mean, back to the some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, like how are we ever to like address all the big things when like internally we haven't even begun to come to terms with like all the things that we're holding that we haven't named, this idea of small is all, like we focus sometimes so much on the big systems because they are big and in front of us, but it's like it's the school, it's the family size, it's the neighborhood, it's the showing up to your school board meeting to say like, hey, like where's the communication about, you know, um, our choice not to be accessories to ICE, for example, in our schools. Like, so I think there are, you're right, ways that we can start with a much smaller circle, not because it's more self-serving because it's about us, but because those are maybe perhaps are like smaller circles of influence and also connection.
For
Yeah.
sure. Well, I so appreciate this. I found this filling for my soul, and I hope others did as well. I did drop in the chat if you are interested in participating in the Repenting of Christian Nationalism sermon series. The information is there, and I just want to say thank you so much, Sophia, for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation and for y'all's time today. Thank you so much.